The human engineer groaned as his spaceship's thrusters fizzled mid-flight, crash landing in a jungle. Out popped Lumi, a sassy 4-foot-tall alien wielding a wrench. The crash was not subtle. Mike's ship groaned and screeched as it ripped through the planet's atmosphere, landing in a heap of twisted metal and smoldering debris. Crawling out, cursing under his breath, he surveyed the dense jungle around him. The air was thick, humid, and smelled like roasted fruit, a smell he immediately hated. "Great," he muttered. "Stranded. Alone. Again. Not quite alone." The voice startled him, and he whipped around to see her. Standing barely 4 feet tall, a petite figure with deep green skin and oversized, luminous eyes regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. She was holding what looked like a wrench, but it glowed faintly, humming softly in her small hands. "You call that a landing?" she quipped, cocking her head. "If I didn't know better, I'd say your ship was drunk." Mike blinked, trying to process her appearance. She was tiny, sure, but the way she carried herself made her presence feel much bigger. Who are you?" "I'm Lumi. I live here." She gestured vaguely to the jungle as though claiming ownership of the entire planet. "And you are?" "Mike," he said, still dazed. "Human. Engineer. And, currently stranded." "Clearly," Lumi said, stepping closer to inspect the wreckage. "Your ship looks like it lost an argument with gravity." "Yeah, thanks for pointing that out," Mike said, folding his arms. "I can help," Lumi said, circling the ship. "But it's gonna cost you." Mike raised an eyebrow. "Cost me? I don't exactly have alien currency lying around." "Don't need currency," Lumi said, smirking. "I want lessons." "Lessons? In human stuff," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "You know, culture, traditions, weird things your species does." Mike hesitated. "Weird things?" "Yeah, like why you crash your giant ships into peaceful planets." She shot back with a grin. He groaned but realized he didn't have much choice. "Fine. Deal. But no guarantees you'll like what you learn." "Perfect," Lumi said, clapping her small hands together. "Let's start with fixing this heap of junk you call a ship. And don't worry, human, I'll take it slow for you." Mike scowled as Lumi laughed, her small frame practically bouncing with energy. He followed her back to the ship, realizing he was in for a long, and probably very frustrating, few days. Lumi immediately began tinkering with a panel on the side of the ship, her movements swift and precise. Mike watched, impressed despite himself. "You're pretty good at that," he admitted. "I know," Lumi said without looking up. "You're not so bad yourself, for a giant." Mike rolled his eyes. "Thanks, I guess." "So," Lumi said casually, "what's the deal with humans and size? You all obsessed with being big, or is that just you compensating?" Mike choked on his own breath. "What? No. That's not." Lumi turned to him, her expression innocent but her tone anything but. "It's okay, you can admit it. Big ship, big tools, what are you hiding, Mike?" "Nothing," he sputtered, his face flushing. Lumi grinned, clearly enjoying his discomfort. "Relax, human. I'm just messing with you." "Yeah, well, maybe focus on the ship instead of my tools," Mike muttered, turning away. The day wore on, filled with Lumi's constant chatter and Mike's attempts to keep up. Every now and then, she'd throw in a question about human behavior that caught him off guard. "Do humans really mate for life, or is that just in the movies?" "What?" "Aye, well, some do. It's complicated." "Huh," Lumi said, pondering this. "My people don't bother with that. Too much commitment. You humans really are strange." Mike decided not to respond, focusing instead on tightening a bolt. But Lumi wasn't done. "Do you guys really kiss as a way of saying you like someone?" "Yes," Mike said, exasperated. "Seems inefficient," Lumi said. "What if the other person has bad breath?" "You just don't kiss them," Mike snapped, and Lumi burst out laughing. By the time the sun set, they had made some progress on the repairs, though Mike wasn't sure how much of it was Lumi's work and how much was her just making fun of him. She sat cross-legged on a piece of debris, watching as he worked. "You're not half bad at this," she said, her tone almost appreciative. "Thanks," Mike said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Still," Lumi added, "it's a shame about the size thing." Mike groaned. "Will you let that go already?" "Never," Lumi said with a mischievous grin. As frustrating as she was, Mike couldn't help but smile. There was something oddly endearing about Lumi's relentless teasing and boundless energy. Maybe, just maybe, being stranded here wouldn't be so bad after all. Mike crouched beside the ship's open panel, tools scattered around him as he muttered under his breath. Lumi was perched on the edge of the ship, her legs swinging, watching him with a grin that he was quickly learning meant trouble. "Careful with that one," she said, pointing to the wire in his hand. "You humans have a knack for blowing things up." Mike gave her a look. "I think I've got it under control, thanks." "Sure you do," Lumi said, hopping down. "But let me know when you're ready for the real expert to step in." He sighed but handed her the wire, knowing she wasn't going to let him live this down. Lumi took it, her small hands working deftly as she started rerouting power. "So, tell me more about humans," she said casually, her eyes focused on the wire. "Why do you guys get so weird about touch?" "Weird?" "Yeah," she said. "Like you flinch every time I get close. What's the deal? Afraid I'll bite?" Mike flushed. "No, it's just, humans have personal space. It's a thing." Lumi paused and looked up at him, clearly unimpressed. "That's dumb." "It's not dumb," Mike argued. "It's respectful." "Respectful of what? Your fragile egos?" she teased, going back to her work. Mike opened his mouth to argue but decided against it. Lumi's laugh rang out, and he couldn't help but feel a small smile tugging at his lips. As they continued working, Lumi's questions became more pointed, and her humor more biting. "So, what do humans do when they, like someone?" she asked, glancing at him. Mike hesitated. "You mean romantically?" "Obviously," she said, rolling her eyes. "Well, we date. Spend time together. Get to know each other." "Sounds boring," Lumi said. "What about the fun stuff?" Mike nearly dropped his wrench. "What fun stuff?" "You know," she said, her grin widening. "The physical stuff. You humans are so uptight about it. Do you all have to fill out forms first?" Mike groaned. "No, we don't fill out forms." "Good," she said, leaning closer. "So, do you prefer tall or short?" "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Lumi said, clearly enjoying his discomfort. "What's your type? Big, tall human women? Or do you go for petite, charming aliens?" Mike didn't know whether to laugh or walk away. "I don't have a type." "Lame answer," Lumi said, shaking her head. "Come on, human, you're stranded on my planet. You might as well be honest." He didn't respond, focusing instead on the bolt he was tightening. Lumi sighed dramatically. "Fine, I'll stop teasing," she said, though the mischievous glint in her eye said otherwise. For now. The day dragged on, filled with Lumi's relentless humor and Mike's increasingly flustered attempts to stay focused. At one point, she managed to wedge herself into a narrow crevice to fix a broken connection, only to get stuck. Mike? What now?" he asked, turning to see her legs kicking uselessly. "I'm kinda stuck." Mike bit back a laugh as he walked over. "Need help?" "No, I'm just hanging out for fun," she said sarcastically. "Of course, I need help." He grabbed her by the waist and started pulling, but her small frame made it harder than he expected. Lumi, of course, didn't let the opportunity pass. "Careful, human," she said, her voice muffled. "You're getting awfully handsy back there." "Would you stop?" Mike said, his face burning. "Hey, you're the one pulling me out," she said with a laugh. "I'm just pointing out the obvious." He finally managed to free her, and she tumbled into his arms, laughing as he set her down. "You're welcome," he said, trying to sound annoyed but failing. "Thanks, giant," she said, brushing herself off. But next time, maybe warn me before you go grabbing me like that. The rest of the day was filled with similar moments. Lumi's teasing, Mike's exasperation, and an undercurrent of something neither of them wanted to acknowledge just yet. By the time they stopped for the night, Mike was exhausted, but Lumi looked as energetic as ever. Not bad for a day's work, she said, sitting cross-legged on the ground. You might actually get this thing flying again. Thanks for the vote of confidence, Mike said, sitting down across from her. Don't get cocky, she said with a smirk. You still need me. He couldn't argue with that. For all her teasing, Lumi was brilliant, and he was starting to see her as more than just a sarcastic alien. There was something about her, her energy, her humor, her ability to make even the most frustrating moments bearable, that was beginning to grow on him. Why are you staring at me? Lumi asked suddenly, breaking his train of thought. I'm not staring, Mike said quickly. Yes, you are, she said, grinning. Do I have something on my face, or are you finally realizing how charming I am? Mike shook his head, laughing despite himself. You're impossible. And yet here you are, she said, leaning back with a satisfied smile. He couldn't argue with that either. Mike woke up to the sound of rain hammering against the metal hull of the ship. The jungle outside was a blur of water and shadows, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Lumi was already up, sitting cross-legged on a makeshift seat, tinkering with a glowing device. Morning, giant, she said without looking up. Morning, Mike muttered, running a hand through his hair. Storm doesn't look like it's going anywhere. Guess you're stuck with me for a while longer, Lumi said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. Mike chuckled. Lucky me. Damn right, she said, finally glancing up at him. I'm the best company you've got on this rock. Only company, he corrected. Details, she said, waving a hand dismissively. They spent the morning inside the cramped shelter, the rain making it impossible to work on the ship. Lumi decided it was the perfect time for more questions. So, do humans cuddle a lot? She asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Mike blinked. Cuddle? Yeah, she said, tilting her head. You know, all that touchy-feely stuff you people seem to enjoy. Is it a human thing or just you? It's not just me, Mike said, feeling his face heat up. It's comforting. Lumi said, looking thoughtful. Sounds inefficient. Not everything has to be efficient, he said. Lumi smirked. Spoken like someone who doesn't have to fit into tight spaces for a living. Mike laughed despite himself. Fair point. A flash of lightning lit up the shelter, followed by a crack of thunder that made the walls tremble. Lumi glanced at the ceiling, then back at Mike. Guess we're stuck in here for a while, she said. Might as well make the most of it. What do you mean? He asked warily. Lumi shrugged. Let's practice cuddling. Mike stared at her. You can't be serious. Why not? She said, her tone innocent but her expression anything but. You said it's comforting, right? And I could use some comfort. This storm is kind of depressing. He hesitated. It's not something you just do with anyone. Why not? She asked, scooting closer. It's not like I bite. Unless you're into that. Mike groaned. Lumi. Oh, relax, human, she said, rolling her eyes. I'm kidding. Mostly. Despite her teasing, she didn't push the subject, and they lapsed into a comfortable silence. Mike couldn't help but notice how close she was sitting, her small frame practically radiating warmth. The storm continued to rage outside, and the hours dragged on. At some point, Lumi got bored and decided to explore the shelter, her curiosity leading to yet another awkward moment. Hey, what's this? She asked, holding up a piece of equipment Mike had stashed away. Don't touch that, he said quickly, reaching for it. Lumi raised an eyebrow. Why not? Is it important? Or personal? It's just sensitive, he said, trying to grab it without knocking over everything else. Sensitive, huh? She said, holding it out of reach. Now I'm curious. Lumi, I'm serious. Before he could finish, the device buzzed to life, emitting a low hum. Lumi's eyes widened, and she burst out laughing. "Oh, I see," she said, grinning. "This is one of those human toys, isn't it?" Mike's face turned bright red. "It's not what you think." "Sure it's not," she said, her laughter echoing through the shelter. "Give it back," he said, snatching it out of her hands. "Relax, human," she said, wiping away tears of laughter. "Your secret's safe with me." Mike groaned, setting the device aside and burying his face in his hands. "You're impossible. And yet you haven't thrown me out," she said, still grinning. By the time the storm began to let up, Mike was thoroughly exhausted, not from the rain, but from Lumi's relentless teasing. She, of course, seemed completely unfazed. "So," she said, leaning back against the wall, "what do humans do to pass the time when they're stuck like this?" Mike hesitated. "Talk, mostly." "About what?" "Anything. Life, dreams, regrets, stuff like that." Lumi considered this. "Okay. You first." "Me?" "Yeah," she said, poking his arm. "Come on, giant. Spill." He sighed but decided to humor her. "I guess. I've always been a bit of a loner. Traveling from one place to another, fixing things, never staying in one spot for too long." "Sounds lonely," Lumi said, her tone softer than usual. "It is," he admitted. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "My people don't do relationships. Not like humans, anyway. We're more practical about it." "Practical?" "Yeah," she said. "No emotions, no attachments. Just convenience." Mike frowned. "That sounds cold." "It works for us," she said with a shrug. "But sometimes I wonder what it'd be like to have something more. Something real." He looked at her, surprised by the vulnerability in her voice. "You're not as heartless as you pretend to be, are you?" "Don't push your luck, human," she said, but there was a faint smile on her lips. The storm finally passed, and the jungle outside came alive with the sounds of chirping and rustling. Lumi stood and stretched, her small frame casting a long shadow in the dim light. "Well," she said, turning to Mike, "I guess we'd better get back to work. Can't have you sticking around forever." "Right," he said, watching as she walked to the ship, her energy as infectious as ever. As frustrating as she could be, Mike couldn't deny that she was growing on him. More than that, he realized, he didn't mind the idea of sticking around a little longer. By the time the storm cleared and the sun reappeared, Mike was back under the hood of the ship, grumbling about stripped wires and faulty circuits. Lumi sat on a nearby rock, lazily tossing small stones into the jungle and watching him with that infuriating smirk that had become her signature. "You know," she said, breaking the silence, "for someone so big, you sure complain a lot." Mike didn't bother looking up. "And for someone so small, you sure talk a lot." "Touché," Lumi said, standing up and brushing off her hands. She walked over to where he was working and leaned against the ship. "So, how's it coming along, genius?" "Almost there," he said, tightening a bolt. "Just need to reconnect a few more systems and—" There was a loud pop, followed by a shower of sparks. Mike jumped back, cursing, while Lumi doubled over with laughter. "Oh, that's rich," she said between giggles. "You humans are so dramatic." "Dramatic? I almost got fried. And yet here you are," she said, still laughing. "Alive and grumpy." Mike glared at her, but he couldn't hold it for long. Her laughter was contagious, and soon he found himself chuckling too. "Okay, fine," he said. "You win. Happy?" "Always," she said with a wink. "Now let me show you how it's done." She pushed past him, her small hands moving deftly as she adjusted the wires. Within seconds the system hummed back to life, the glow of the control panel signaling that she'd fixed it. "See?" she said, turning to him with a triumphant grin. "Easy." Yeah, Mike said, shaking his head. "Show off." As they worked together to finish the repairs, Mike found himself stealing glances at Lumi. There was something mesmerizing about her confidence, her sharp wit, the way she seemed to light up every moment with her energy. He caught himself smiling more than once, and he couldn't deny the growing warmth in his chest. "What are you staring at?" Lumi asked, not looking up from her work. "Nothing," he said quickly. "Liar," she said, glancing at him. "If you've got something to say, spit it out." Mike hesitated, then took a deep breath. "You're different than anyone I've ever met." "Obviously," she said with a smirk. "I'm an alien." "That's not what I mean," he said, his tone softer. "You're amazing." For once, Lumi seemed caught off guard. She stared at him for a moment, then quickly recovered, her grin returning. "Flattery will get you everywhere, human." "I'm serious," he said, stepping closer. "You're smart, funny, and honestly, I don't know how I'd have gotten through this without you." Lumi tilted her head, studying him. "Are you hitting on me?" Mike's face turned red. "What? No. I mean, maybe? I don't know." She laughed, but it wasn't her usual teasing laugh. It was softer, almost nervous. "Well, that's a first. A human hitting on me. Is that okay?" he asked hesitantly. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped closer, her luminous eyes locking onto his. "You're not bad for a giant," she said quietly. "And you're not bad for someone who doesn't take anything seriously," he replied. She smirked, but there was a warmth in her expression that hadn't been there before. "You've got guts, Mike. I'll give you that." Before he could respond, she leaned in and kissed him. It was quick, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt through him all the same. When she pulled back, her smirk was back in full force. "Don't get used to it, human." Mike grinned. "Too late." The moment didn't last long, though. Lumi quickly shifted back to her usual self, teasing him relentlessly as they finished the repairs. But there was a new undercurrent to their banter, a warmth, a connection that hadn't been there before. By the time the ship was fully operational, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the jungle. Mike stood back, admiring their work, while Lumi leaned against the ship, arms crossed. "Well," she said, "looks like you're good to go." "Yeah," he said, though his voice lacked enthusiasm. She noticed. "What's wrong? Don't tell me you're getting attached." He laughed nervously. "Maybe a little." "Don't worry," she said, her tone teasing but her eyes soft. "I'll miss you too, giant." Mike hesitated, then said, "You could come with me." Lumi raised an eyebrow. "What?" "I mean it," he said. "You said you were curious about humans, right? What better way to learn than to see our world for yourself?" She seemed genuinely surprised. "You want me to leave my planet?" "I want you to come with me," he said simply. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then, a slow smile spread across her face. "You're full of surprises, Mike. Is that a yes?" he asked hopefully. "Maybe," she said, stepping closer. "But only if you promise to keep things interesting." "I think I can manage that," he said with a grin. As they boarded the ship together, Lumi's laughter echoed through the cabin. "You know, giant," she said, settling into the co-pilot's seat, "this might just be the start of something fun." Mike smiled, starting the engines. "I think you're right." And with that, they took off, leaving the jungle, and their old lives, behind.